Morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, the GDN Conversation Series, Session 5, exploring the dimensions of trust, the last of our 5 sessions that we've done in partnership with the Velocity Network Foundation. Today's session is about adopting change, driving education and innovation, understanding the dynamics of change management and the recognition ecosystem, making that link between institutional issuers, students, as well as employers, government, and the like. So we're going to cover quite a few topics in this session today. My name is Joanne Duclas. I'm the Executive Director for the GDN Network, and I'm pleased to welcome my colleagues here today. And I'm going to say hello to each of them. Hello, Rick. Thank you for joining us. Please say hello to our audience.
Hi there. Great to see many of you. Hopefully, I'll see many of you live when we meet. Rick Torres and Joanne, would you like me to provide some background, at least real quick?
Yes,
sure.
Please.
So those of you that know me, I know I was the CEO of the National Student Clearinghouse and a co-founder of the Groningen Declaration Network itself back in the early days of 2012. And over the years, my early work focused, looked at closed network-based trust verification systems, which is what the clearinghouse essentially had. And then also, I got involved with early stages of interoperable learner records, which then became LERs, learning and employment records, and permission data and interoperability as a centerpiece of a concept. Since I retired, and yes, I did retire finally from my day job about 6 months ago, I've been working on how that work of my previous time as a CEO is intersecting with artificial intelligence and how we think about learning skills and outcomes and transference of skills that are going to be digitally enabled, especially when in the world of agents and what's going on out there. And how that will translate to a series of change management challenges for the industry, right, in general, right? I think it's just going to be a very, very steep climb, but more on that later. But great to see everyone.
And I just want to highlight, he did say founder of the GDN network. That is so true. He also happens to be the chair of the GDN Strategic Advisory Committee. So he's delightfully agreed to continue on. He'll be doing an AI feature keynote along with Alex Kaplan at the Oslo, Norway convening that we're holding at the end of October through the GDN network. Thank you, Rick, for joining us. Naomi, please say hello to our colleagues.
Thank you, Joanne. Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi Sekresh, and I'm the head of Global Education Ecosystem Strategy at Velocity Network Foundation. And to give a little context, what Velocity Network Foundation is about is the provision of a trust framework and infrastructure components to enable a network for the global exchange of verifiable digital credentials so that credentials can be trusted anywhere in the world when they're issued to any party, when they're shared to any other party, and everyone within the framework knows exactly what their roles and responsibilities are and can exhibit trusted behavior and also be held accountable for those actions so that literally in the most highly regulated, high-stakes situations, you can place people in jobs and trust the credentials that people share with you. So that's a little bit about the Velocity Network Foundation, and we're very pleased to be partnered with one of our members and advisory board members and really important contributors here, the GDN Network, to host these events, and really also to be joined by 2 additional members, Rick with NSC formerly, and also Neil from the REC. And I know he'll introduce himself and a little bit more about his fantastic background.
Thanks, Naomi. Neil, please say hello to our audience.
Well, thank you, Joanne. Thanks for the build-up, Naomi. My name is Neil Carberry. I am an executive member of a body called the World Employment Confederation, which is the global body for businesses that support labour market enablement, think recruiters, HR firms, staffing firms, and so forth. And we are naturally interested in things which enable people to meet their goals in the labour market and to get into work quickly, and kind of proof of qualification, proof of identity. All of these things are processes that people go through at great length every day, everywhere in the world. So as a kind of certified labour market geek, that's how I got into this job. I spent some time on the UK's national national low pay commission that sets the minimum wage, for instance, on the UK equivalent of what Americans would call the National Labour Relations Board, whatever that is in your country. That is my background. My main job is, as Naomi hinted, I'm the chief executive of the REC, which is the UK's trade body for talent firms, for recruiters, for staffing firms. And we are currently working with colleagues at Velocity and a couple of other partners to look at how we introduce a platform for verifiable digital credentials for the UK workforce in a way that reduces costs to our members, but actually much more important to that, gets people into work more quickly and more easily, and just loosens up the flows of our labour market. We see huge potential if we can get a UK platform off the ground, and that's one of our big focuses at the moment.
Thank you so much, Neil. And to our audience, I invite you through the Q&A to send any questions you have as we go along this morning and this afternoon. I will be keeping a watch out, and I'll make sure our colleagues have a chance to chime in when the moment is right to make sure your question is answered. Today, what we're hoping for is that you leave with an understanding of the fundamentals needed to ensure creation of a scaled digital ecosystem that enables rapid access to learning and work. An understanding of what it takes and what are some of the challenges to do this, and some examples of possible exemplar frameworks, models, and approaches. So there's quite a bit we're going to cover in the short time we have, but we're not leaving it there. We're going to take a videotape of this particular webinar along with the others we've done in the series. We'll be publishing them in an open source way on our shared website that we've created with Velocity Network. And so I encourage you to take a look. There are multiple resources, and we will be adding to that as we go along and continue to build out what information you need to have at your fingertips so that you can make something happen in your communities that is similar to what my colleagues have done around the table. So with further ado, one of the things I want to get into, and I'm going to start with you, Neil, when we talk about adoption by employers, this kind of digital ecosystem, help us understand what that means. What does adoption really mean?
So we all know, we see in the political debates that governments around the world have been progressively clearer that they expect employers to know who they have in their business, know that they have a right to work in the country that they are in. And of course, in lots of regulated professions, registered nurses are a great example, that this person is who they say they are. And that's always been a challenge. It's always involved some process. And traditionally in the UK, it's involved me as the candidate traveling to your office, Joanne, as the employer, and waving a passport in front of your face, for instance. But actually, increasingly, the amount of data we have to check is growing. And of course, in this AI world, proof of human is becoming more and more difficult. How do you know, Joanne, that I am a human being, that I am the human being I say I am with the skills I say I am, and actually that I'm the human being who's turned up this morning on your site where you are not, you're on a different site 30 miles away. So that requires a lot of checking. And frankly, traditional methods of doing that from an employer's perspective are just too onerous to be useful. But also, we have come to a realization, I think, as an employer community, as a private sector community, very much the private sector voice in this organization, that actually the way we've traditionally thought about our HR systems is fundamentally broken. So as I started as a recruitment consultant in London in the 1990s, and I used to sell our services on the basis that I had the biggest database of candidates in our specialist area of any of our competitors. So I knew everyone in the field, and I knew who to call. It's taken a lot for employers to appreciate that them having the data isn't the solution. The person having the data, who has the data that provides the solution, is the candidate in our world or the graduate in a university world. It's about how we enable the people to whom we have either deferred a degree, or a government has given a right to work, or an employer has given an accreditation of work history, how we enable them to use that. So when we talk about adoption, the first and most important thing is there's a bit of a mindset shift that needs to happen amongst employers. And then the second piece then is, well, how do we adopt? And we'll go on to talk about atomic networks and all of these things. But this is very much a network problem. So it's quite difficult for single employers to take it on. And the best example, and Naomi's colleague, Etan Bernstein, shared this example with me a while ago, and I steal it with pride. And Naomi can tell Etan that. If you look at when you fly, wherever you're flying in the world, you change planes at an airport somewhere. You have on your phone your boarding passes, and it doesn't matter that you're changing from one airline to another, because your boarding pass is all the same. Why is that? It's because the airlines agreed the standard. Adoption means kind of not having a million standards, but having a few standards, or preferably one standard, which are genuinely adoptable, because for the most part, most firms are too small to make these decisions in and of themselves. So for me, adoption is about two things. One, it's about appreciating that what we've done up to now isn't the answer, and that we need a mindset shift. And then secondly, it's about, well, how do we build a network so we move together into what happens next?
I would say, Rick, I'm going to ask you to chime in now. You've got a lot of experience in exactly that. So when we think about atomic networks and the work that you've done, help us understand what that concept means and how it relates to what Neil shared.
Yeah, so thank you. And Neil, I loved your story there, and also the way you described sort of this first challenge around adoption. Atomic networks for me implies that it is a network or a set of things that come together that become self-sustaining, because the value proposition for each participant in the network, it's derived from engaging within that concept, right? So every additional member or every additional participant then increases the value prop for all, right? And good examples of that are, obviously all the social networks out there, like Facebook and Meta, LinkedIn, others, right? The more people you have engaging, the more sub networks get created, and it becomes a self-sustaining thing. Right. And I mean, other examples include Uber and Lyft and all of those, Airbnb, right? So these are classics. So if you think about creating a credentialing and portability oriented atomic network, that's one of the first conditions that need to be met, is how do you make sure that each participant, both requester and issuer and learner, everyone in the network actually is gaining benefit as it grows. Okay. And I think that is a clear, issue and opportunity as you think about how to go about creating an atomic effect, all right, with credentialing and portability.
And do you think, Naomi, maybe the Velocity Network is a good example of that? I know the GDN endeavors to do that, but when you're thinking about building trust and you're thinking about adoption and atomic energy, what's that secret to help create that coalition of the willing, to help create that atomic network in your experience?
Well, I think it's a few things. And first, I'd like to acknowledge and say thank you to Rick for really clearly defining atomic network, because I think that was very well described, that you need all the actors that are starting out together, holding hands to derive benefits and be the right actors to participate together. For example, you mentioned a social network. If you have 5 people and they don't know each other, well, that doesn't really help you snowball the solution. You need the 5 people to actually know each other and have relevance. And so, in terms of those first steps in achieving an atomic network, I think it's really important to have a trusted leader in the center of development of a atomic network to pull in the friends, so to speak, and to know the parties and how they interact and have their brand and their leadership be the catalyst for the additional few participants that then can grow their impact and influence. And I would actually flip that conversation back to Neil, who has a lot of experience leading right now at Atomic Network. But I'd also reference that Velocity has one example that I think is very strong in the US with HCA Healthcare, where they are leading a network in healthcare, specifically pulling in their school partners, pulling in some of their education and training partners, pulling in some of their staffing firms, their job boards, their information systems, their HR tech players, and they themselves are a leading employer, doing peer education and outreach to say, hey, it's not enough if I do this alone for my own benefit. I need a group of entities, hospital, healthcare entities doing this with me, and we can break ground by doing this together. And so I think I think the leadership and the relevance are two of the starting points. And then there's some additional things that come into play from a change management perspective.
Now, I don't know if others want to comment around this space before we dig into it more. Is there any other comments around some of the core fundamentals, definitions that we've highlighted? Anything else anyone wants to add?
Can I just
Yeah.
ping in on this question of atomic networks, Joanne? I think there's a discipline in setting this up to going looking for what your atomic networks are and what their drivers are. So as Rick said, within the network, there's got to be a reason for everyone to want to play. And certainly in our experience in what we're doing with the UK, what we're finding is that supply chains are a really great place to do that. So if you're a big staffing firm placing engineering people into businesses in the northwest of England, you will typically have 2 or 3 tiers of staffing firms feeding into you, and you've got the relationship with the client. Now that gives you significant power because you set the terms of that engagement. You also have significant risk, if there's any illegal working, if there's anything unsafe. So you've got reason to turn around to that supplier base and say, we would like you to establish compliance by this route. Now, if that route is also simpler for your suppliers as a system set up on the Velocity network would be, and it's more transportable for workers, you have the 3 things that the 3 parties well aligned in the way that Rick set out. And certainly what our experience has been is that you can't boil the ocean with this stuff, but what you need to do is find these atomic networks and then stitch them together. If you have enough of them, they start to stitch together. And realistically, when we are going into the pilot phase of what we're doing now, if I get 2 or 3 of the big staffing firms in the UK really aggressively going after this, the rest will follow because the case makes itself. And then we turn around to, for instance, UK universities and say, well, wouldn't life be easier if you were issuing degrees on Velocity? And actually take time out of back offices in universities across the country.
So this sort of rolls into change fundamentals, Rick. And I'm hearing choose your teammates wisely and thoughtfully, find that champion and so on. What other change fundamentals should people keep in mind, Rick?
I think one big one is understanding how you move from a proof of concept within an industry to something that's going to scale at a national level. And it really raises some questions about, to truly get to scale, the discussion around open versus closed systems becomes a really important question. So, in my previous role, we had the benefit, the clearinghouse had the benefit of being a closed system. Everybody kind of understood where the credential came from. There was a lot of trust in that. And then the background screeners trusted everything that's going on. The challenge that I see fundamentally that we are going to have to address both domestically, not only in the United States, but in many countries and internationally, is that there may be really good, trusted, verified networks out there like Velocity, right? So there will be other ecosystems that perhaps are in other disciplines, or countries may have other ecosystems. The challenge that needs to be put together in the open versus closed system is the requester of the credential needs to actually understand that, is this claimed credential coming from a trusted ecosystem or not? So how do we make sure that the requesters, because it all comes down to whoever's requesting the proof, that they actually trust that the information that's coming to them is from a trusted environment. And I want to build on Neil's example of boarding passes. For me, and I think one of the examples I always use is the international payment systems. To your point, there are several big, but not many things that work well. You have a currency translation system, you have the SWIFT network, and it doesn't matter if you're in Argentina, Italy, Portugal, Norway, or South Africa. When you present a Visa card, it's a trusted network amongst trusted networks, right? So you have different trusted financial credit networks that the recipient, who's the recipient, the storekeeper, the hotel, that they trust that network is in fact going to yield a payment to them in exchange for the services that they provide. When you think about an atomic network, it kind of needs to work the same way, where various networks can come together, okay, in a trusted network of networks. And I think there's a lot, that is a massive topic for conversation. So I think that's one area where I think big decisions have to be made, right? Because you can build it within your own ecosystem, but then how do you combine it with others so that then it becomes sort of this atomic effect, and not just one network to conquer them all, right? It's how do you do that?
Well,
that's just one example.
Well, even using that example, it puts the citizen at the center, because it's the citizen that is leading on that trusted transaction. Any comments around that? Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think, Rick is hitting on an interesting question. I think it's one that Arya is definitely digging into from a network of networks perspective. But I think what has to happen first is for these open ecosystems to develop, get critical density, and thrive, in the sense that Velocity Network is a protocol. It describes itself as a protocol. It's the technology can be changed out. It's an open source technology. The technology components can be switched at any time. But what is fundamental about it is the legal framework and the rule set and the protocol that everyone is following, so that a network of staffing firms in the UK can be completely compatible, interoperable with the HCA healthcare network, can be completely compatible, interoperable with the state of Arkansas that's going live on Velocity Network soon. And so anywhere in the world, you can have an ecosystem spring up. And by using these open source tools and protocols, and by it playing to the least common denominator of what everyone needs to feel safe, to move data in privacy preserving, secure ways, it creates the opportunity for this open network to form, for these smaller atomic networks to form on top of a common communication pattern that can be expanded, replicated, used more broadly. So at the same time, so it's one, that open ecosystem approach and that protocol development and that decentralization as well of the decision making of that protocol, so that all of those different needs can be met at the same time. And then, yes, there is going to be some instances of a few different protocols, for example, some projects in the EU that may remain independent, and then making sure that their trust standards are up to the same level of another entity like the Velocity Network, so that they can be completely compatible and seamless from the outside user in the future. And so just want to address some of those trust framework aspects, the protocol aspects, and that open ecosystems approach so that anyone can grab the protocol, use it within their home environment, build out their atomic network with their friends and their key players, but have it be instantly connected to everyone else who's doing the same thing and achieving their own goals. The other thing, the other linchpin in that that's really important that we haven't touched on, that goes back to Neil's definition of what is an employer's definition of adoption. One nuance I'd like to put on that is that for an employer to adopt this, it has to be something that would work for any employer. And it's very different when you hire someone to maybe move a box or paint your house from when you're hiring someone to be a nurse by a patient's bedside or a doctor performing critical life-saving surgery. And for a common protocol to work across all of those dimensions and environments, it has to play to the most rigorous standard in all cases so that you can trust the credential that's issued to the doctor, and you can trust the one that's issued to the painter or the technician or some other job that may be less critical from a regulatory standpoint. And yet, any employer can accept all of those credentials, trust all of those credentials, process all of those credentials, work together, and know that it can be used in any situation. And that's one aspect that Velocity Network solves for and really focuses upon is how do we need to design a protocol collectively so that it can be used in the most strenuous of circumstances? How can we design a protocol and a network so that it's compliant with the most rigorous privacy laws, for example, GDPR in Europe? And by playing to the biggest constraint, it makes it possible for everyone to participate because everyone's needs can be met, even if they're less requiring less trust. And so when you think about like networks of networks and trust frameworks working globally, it really comes down to the trust levels that a more stringent network can never accept a lower level of trust. It would have to be that those less trusted credentials eventually rise to the same level of rigor of those higher trust networks.
Rick, do you, just because you've worked outside of the VNF, do you, and I do have a question from the audience, but before we go to Nicole's question, how would you frame this? What is your reaction?
Right. So, and I'm going to, in this piece, I want to build on what Naomi was saying, but actually kind of also toss it to Neil a little bit with the following sort of caveat, which is that I think we can have a great working set of plumbing, right? Pipes and plumbing that will take whatever information is put on it. One of the biggest challenges, though, is the level of credentials that are actually there and their relative portability and meaningfulness to employers, meaning, credential data quality, the reliability of the information that's there and the definitional consistency of that, the breadth, the fields where credentials are available, like which do you have, a broad enough field, or is it what sector are you talking about? And then the depth, how far do you go? So it's really interesting. I worked in healthcare for a few years. And actually I was working with a hospital system that competed with HCA in Northern Virginia. And one of the interesting aspects of that was that when they hired nurses, okay, they needed more than just a credential. There were a set of skills and certifications that also, whether you were an emergency nurse physician, a nurse taking care of children, or you were working in the surgical room, the skill sets that were required and the certifications were all part of this ecosystem. So when you think about what it's going to take for an employer to adopt a system, right, which is the key piece here, right? I mean, the learner benefits if they can get themselves into a job. So Neil, I'll toss it to you about data consistency, data depth, data breadth, and that part of the very important aspect of how a person represents themselves versus what an employer needs to see.
So before Neil, before you go, I do want to mention one of the questions from our audience touches on this,
Okay.
where they're saying, how do we ensure that the digital credential exchange network or trust community complies with the strictest applicable privacy requirements? And yet there's so many different privacy requirements. So how do we avoid, when we're moving things around, the data protection gaps? Because not everybody adheres to GDPR, not everybody adheres to FIPA. They all have their different nuances. Any comments to flavor that data preservation and privacy piece?
Well,
I can jump in on that quick from just a general perspective on the Velocity network, that we have compliance committees that actually reconcile the different privacy regulations globally. And that's why, for example, there is a trust framework to make sure that those different requirements are satisfied across industries and across geographies. So I wanted to explain that in a very mechanical sense of the governance structures that exist within a trust framework to absolutely stay current on those issues and make sure that they're reconciled into the protocol. So the protocol is never static. It is evolving as per the needs of our society. But then, Neil, to you to really put some color on it from a practical employer sense.
Yeah, look, I think the whole point about trust frameworks is entirely right, and obviously at the UK we're in the process of putting into place an act of parliament that regulates what the UK trust framework is. You know, it's the state level regulation in the United States. It'll be federal action and elsewhere in jurisdictions around the world. Look, I'm sitting here in the United Kingdom, which is still basically a GDPR country. So the data protection rules are the same as those in the EU. One of the things about the transition of control over the data to the individual from the issuer is actually we think it makes GDPR compliance in our parochial European world much, much easier. Because ultimately, we are being voluntarily shared things on a check code basis by workers rather than holding large amounts of data for the long term. So I think if we get the technology right, actually this is a privacy law compliance enabler, reduces risk for employers if we get it right. And then you get to kind of Rick's point, which is, well, what do we want and how do we make this work? Well, ultimately, and Naomi, you might want to say something about this from the point of view of the Velocity network. Ultimately, you want to get to a point where the main question a checker has is, do I trust the issuer? Because within a well-designed system like Velocity, something that's coming through on the blockchain as a credential has been issued validly by a valid issuer. Therefore, you can trust the fact that this thing exists. The question is only what's the standing of the issuer. I think there's a couple of ways in which you build this trust. One is that you get people who people have a level of default trust in to issue. So the most obvious example that's going on globally at the moment is the mobile driving license. So how do I, in my REC role, persuade HM government that in the United Kingdom, the mobile driving license should be accompanied by a Velocity credential so that it is checkable via Velocity? And that gets to Naomi's point about the nature of Velocity as a protocol. Our answer to kind of interoperability is we should be able to draw a lot of this into the Velocity protocol because it is simply a raincoat into which issuers put on over what they're already doing. And that's actually the nature of the discussion we're having with staffing firms who have their own identity checking businesses at the moment. We're not going to take over the identity checking they're doing. We're going to give them a tool to share the outcomes of their identity checking. The other thing we can do quite swiftly is do things which have obvious benefit to the issuer and to the checker as well as the client, and which don't have people outside our industry with a role. And the clearest thing there is work history. Almost every employer still checks references. in most countries. Those references typically take up time. They're a phone call, they're a form, they're increasingly those references are statement of fact. This person did this job from that date to that date in this business.
Yeah.
Issue the credential when they finish, and then you build up a muscle memory that then eases adoption and eases the discussion to have with external parties like colleges, like government about further issuance.
So I just want to, and I know, Rick, you have a comment you want to make. Because of what's coming in from our audience, we're getting into who determines the level of trust networks. There are other trust frameworks. The one I existed in that we created in Canada, we worked with W3C technology, but also legacy technology. And so we had to navigate more than 20 different privacy regulations, including GDPR and American privacy legislation, et cetera. So we also used, and this is about change fundamentals, we used the tools that we had. One of them was ensuring data standards. So we used the PESC XML standards. Plus, we also made sure that, as an example, we also made sure that we use contracts as a way to hold our partners to the toes, which their toes to the fire, Rick, and ourselves as well, to use your point about a closed network. So there are different models and alliances out there. Rick, can you add some color to some of this?
Well, yeah, yes, and I wanted to essentially tack on a couple of what I think are really important points to what Neil and Naomi were talking about. The first is that, we started out talking about creating atomic sustainability. And I think that goes back to credential availability and meeting requester needs, right? Because at some point there needs to be this ecosystem, and those needs need to meet the needs of issuers and learners. I think MIT did a great study back in 2022, I think, or it was called The Last Mile, or 2023. And one of the things they talked about, and this is going to tie in the point about privacy, is that employers want to be able to mine skills. They don't care about the name. They don't care if it's Neil or Naomi or Ricardo or Joanne. But what they want to be able to do is say, I have a pool of skill sets that I am looking for, and I want to get to a narrowing of the pool of potential people, and then I can decide on other things like location and blah, blah, blah. But I just want to understand who I'm dealing with in order to increase the return on investment of the ROI, right, of adoption. Now, the challenge that creates, and I'm going to put this out here because we cannot have this discussion without talking about agents, right, and AI agents. The challenge that this is presenting is that you have a lot of firms out there now in the recruiting space that are using AI agentic capacity in its truest form. And the problem is, as we all know, is that AI is evolving, every week, right? There's ChatGPT 5 came out last week, and, there's all kinds of changes going on. The issue, though, in the recruiting and credentialing sphere that we have to have in mind is that not all of these platforms are ready for prime time. There was a recruiting engine called a company called Eightfold, literally the number 8 followed by fold, eightfold.ai. And they did a test looking at Grok, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, ChatGPT in its various forms. And what they were testing for was disparate impact, okay, based on the credential. So how do you winnow down a pool of candidates and get them down to a list who then you actually care about? Okay, these are verified artifacts. And what they found is that when you look at gender and race, it actually created double digit, 20%, 30% disparate impact effects. So, so the biggest concern here is, and thinking about how, if we're a recruiting entity, we're going to use artificial intelligence as an agent. The trust has got to be that there isn't bias going on, okay, in the selection process. And that's really important, right? So you talk about a key condition for the learner and a key condition for the employer, and actually for the issuer, is that there isn't this bias in the ecosystem that is producing the short list of potential candidates for a particular role. And so these are the kinds of things that when we begin to think about forming an atomic network of any kind and trying to test it, these are the kinds of things that you actually need to look for, right? Because you need to be able to scale and catch it and be able to scale it. Because HTA, I would think, is not alone, right? In trying to say, how do we source the best candidates for the best roles, and making sure that the pool that they are choosing from is as complete as possible, right? Short of bias, and that's how you get trust. That's an important element of trust in the ecosystem.
So if I was to ask each of you for a short answer to the following question, who determines the level of the trust networks? And I think what the question really is, who decides who's trusted and who decides why they're trusted? How would you respond? I'll start with Neil.
I think with all these questions, there are two levels. Three levels: the standards, compliance, and enforcement. At an enforcement level, states will define and will protect, and
The role of government.
the role of government. But that role of government is really important, because the real risk, given the example Rick's just shared, the real risk is actually that as actors in the labor market, we get it wrong and we end up cutting off the advantages that, for instance, AI can bring us, the digitization of the hiring process can bring us, because some things go wrong and government just pulls the shutters down in the way governments want to do when they have to just put a stop to something. So that, if that's your enforcement level, there's then a compliance level, which is, how do we hold each other to account? What do we expect of each other? And how do we not leave that implicit? How do we articulate it? And that, I think, is, and I would say this as Chief Executive of a trade association, I think that is the role for organizations like GDN, like my own trade association, to articulate what the standards and expectations here are. But ultimately, it's also about individual actors deciding who and what they want to trust. And the advantage of it, atomic networks, is you getting a group of those individual actors together on the same page starts to move things. That's why
Self-governing.
we talk about the atomic network, but it's always going to be at those three levels.
Yeah, my
Any
answer to
comment?
that is that, very simply, is that I think the recipient, right? Whoever is the requester, whoever is making the request, if it's a school asking about Rick's former history, or an employer basically asking about what I've done, or do I have the right skills? If they don't believe what they're getting out of the system is what it needs to be, they will walk, right?
Yeah.
And so in its simplest form, the closed network of the clearinghouse only worked because it gave the exact thing that they were looking for. Like, did they have a degree or did they not, right? I mean, it was a simple yes, no validation. And many times that got tested. I mean, the classic story in a closed network is, this person claimed to have a degree, sent a picture of themselves walking down the aisle with a diploma in their hand. And it turns out that they were 3 credits short. They never took the 3 credits, and they allowed them to walk, but they never earned the credential, right? So that's the veracity piece, right? So you can do that, but it's more than that, right? You got to be able to have the employers trust the entirety of that ecosystem in order to then make it work, right? Or the recipient, whether it's a school or whomever it is, a learner wants to go from point A to point B. Can they use that network to do it, right? And I think that's the recipient will be the major driver of that.
Can I just add one thing onto that, Rick, comes back to your point about diversity, inclusion, fairness, that is why preparing the recipient to make those decisions is really important, because my core view is that ultimately people hire people, and companies will come to appreciate that things that happen in their AI black box that are discriminatory are still illegal and they're still liable for them. So the question then becomes, and this is very much our focus at the REC, and I know with other employers around the world, which is ultimately the job of making those decisions is going to become more skilled, and it's going to require greater levels of preparation for dealing with this world. And I think acknowledging that in companies' people planning is really important, especially in kind of Western European countries, bit different in the United States, but certainly in Western European countries where we're getting used to having a tighter and tighter labor market, where the labor supply glut of the last 50 years has now gone. Companies themselves are having to get used to the concept that hiring will become more difficult and more high skilled. And I think that goes hand in hand with spending more time thinking about what systems we want to use like this.
So when I think about all of this, one of the questions that comes to mind is concepts like trust registries of trust registries and all that kind of stuff. Any comments around the importance of trust registries in these various ecosystems? Because you are not going to, I can only speak from the country that I'm in. We have 13 different provinces and territories. There's many different sectors. There's different levels of trust assurance needed, but trust registries can actually help to assure that trust. Any comments around that? Who would like to go? Naomi?
Yeah, I can take that one because it's in our, and it really ties back to the prior discussions that we've had in that successfully creating an ecosystem where diverse players can trust one another and move from one atomic network to the next atomic network. Because when you think about like a student, when that student goes to your school, you don't know where they're going to go next. You don't know what industry, when they change industry, when they get re-educated, when they change geographies, move to another country. You really don't know where that person's going to end up. So it becomes much more complex than just registering a set of entities on a list. Like you can trust these 10. And then so the world is going to know, like, oh, this one you can trust those 10, and this guy says you could trust these 20, and this one says you can trust these 5 over here if you're under these circumstances. That type of vision for digital credentialing at scale with full global interoperability and mobility is untenable. I've never heard anyone articulate, trust registry in a way that would actually work and fill in the gaps between the little atomic networks to really achieve what we want to achieve with people's data. And why I say that ties back is to the other conversations, is that I think Neil touched upon it, and I didn't say enough about it with the idea of how we satisfy the data privacy regulations in, for example, Velocity Network. Self-sovereignty is very critical because only the individual knows all the places they want to take their data and how they want to use it and whether someone abuses their data or uses it improperly and how they want to address that. Only the individual living their life, going through their career journey, sharing their data and rescinding it is going to have that ability to navigate all instances properly. And so Velocity and our members really believe in empowering the individual with their data in a way that you can trust that individual. And so the trust framework is so that not that you're issuing to a place and there's never data stored on Velocity Network. We're anchoring the trust. We're creating the legal framework around the interactions so that when you share your data with a relying party, you are in fact agreeing contractually how they're able to use your data, how long they're able to use your data, etc. You are choosing what you share with that third party. And so self-sovereignty is critical in this work. The individual and data ownership and mobility is critical in this work. And then the trust framework that goes beyond just a registry of issuing entities is really so that every party in that chain of events, the issuer, the data processor, the individual, the digital wallets that store their data, the relying parties that receive their data and then process it downstream within their employer systems, that every party knows what rules they're playing by and that every party can be held accountable if they break those rules with respect to people. people's data. And so I hope that that kind of answers that question of trust registry. Like, yes, issuer registries and trust registries, but that and that this self-sovereignty piece of individuals owning their own data is the only way to solve all the privacy law constraints that are out there.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
so
Rick.
Joanne, if I may, on that point, I think if you look at registries of registries, right, you know, the registry of registries, right, Enoch Narek started going down that path, right? I mean, they tried to identify trusted players internationally in different countries and so on. And I want to go to the financial system. You look at the SWIFT system, okay, there are competitors. These are people that compete with each other that also cooperate with a set of standards. Okay, and if you want to take a lesson off of how do you do this, look no further than what it takes to operate an international currency and credit exchange ecosystem. I think they have laid out some of the fundamental principles of what it takes to work. To the point, now, in my previous background, I worked at one of the major credit card issuers, and you know, we would meet every 3 months with our competitors to discuss fraud. Everybody would hang up their hat, right, on the door, like they're professional, like I'm with, you know, Citibank, I'm with whomever, okay? But you would sit down and have a conversation about something that impacted everyone, right? Because we were all in it to keep the network trusted and keep the network safe, irrespective of the fact that you had many different players, Amex with its own network, Discover with its own network, and so on. They all came together to protect the viability of the entire network. So if you had to aspire for something,
brand. Yeah.
right, if you wanted to aspire for something, it's how do you ensure, right, that the members and the participants, even if they're competitors, are willing to sit down and have a conversation to ensure the integrity of the entirety, right? And I think that's kind of the big opportunity that sits in front of us, is not to reinvent the wheel, but to understand what actually works.
This is where actually I have to say that the work of the GDN network, not to tout a horn, but you're one of the founder. I do have to say that the work of the GDN network has helped people put those batons at the door so that they can come into rooms like this and say, regardless of what protocols or what have you you're working on, how do we work together to solve the bigger problems? Some of our audience is asking questions around this. One comment that was made is, you know, with these atomic networks, it could evolve into smaller alliances, but could also contribute to the fragmentation and the tensions that will result in. It will cause. An example being competing for airtime, competing to say that your trustworthiness is recognized, etc. That's happening now, though. That happened before technology came into the mix. But I think one of the threads that I kind of want to pull in all of this, because we are talking about what are those fundamentals that you need to have in place, is it fair to say that getting your data house in order will be essential in order to ensure all the things that all of you are describing? Your local data house, making sure that things are properly identified, standards followed, etc., so that this kind of technical interconnectivity can happen that Naomi was alluding to, for verification and the like. Is that a fair statement?
Literally everything starts with sorting your data out. You know, if you go to AI, well, you can only AI things you can automate. You can only automate good data, really. And the same goes here. So I think that focus on structure of data, and I think, and this is a challenge for lots of businesses and institutions, not being too proud about kind of it was invented here. Go back to my 1990s database as a recruiter. We wrote our own database and it did all the things we wanted to do, made it completely interoperable with any other business. And we do have to kind of start to kind of allow the technology to redesign how we hold data for interoperability as part of all of this. And that is a long and slow and painful process. And one of the things, Joanne, I really wanted to emphasize here is this is not a light switch. It's a fader switch. It's a bit like self checkout, self cashier tills in the supermarket. They put them in 15 years ago, and if you're me, surly, Scottish, don't like talking to people, ideal, massive introvert, never like to talk to me. But if you're my mum, less surly, also Scottish, likes talking to people, she will never use one, and she'll be shopping for another 20 years. So there's a transition here, and we see that, I think, Naomi, in some of the ecosystems that Velocity has already rolled out, that there are enthusiastic adopters and there are less enthusiastic adopters. So in thinking about sorting our data out, it's about enabling what's going to happen, but also continuing to enable what we've always done and appreciating that will change over time. So we sort the data out, we think forward on how we manage our data. I think that brings into clarity some of the concerns we might want to wash through as we do that, like Rick's points about diversity and inclusion. And it also speaks towards having a shared set amongst businesses, not of what we're trying to do, all doing the same thing, but that ability to park the baton and have a discussion about what's the shared goal that we're going for. The thing I just wanted to land on that before we move too far past it is that also changes the role of regulators in quite a powerful way. So if you look at something like SWIFT, governments have a big role to play in overseeing SWIFT and structuring SWIFT. You saw that when Russia invaded the Ukraine, for instance. But that doesn't mean SWIFT is a governmental institution. It's an institution of the market. And I think increasingly these mixed models where government and public authority issuers are involved but not driving is where we go for the trust framework, not least because in lots of authorities, if we leave it to government, we'll be waiting a long time. You'll know, Joanne, that if we waited for Alberta to talk to Ontario about things, we could be here till the next ice age. But there's a piece here about sort your data out and then be prepared to have that conversation. Feels really important.
Can I
I
build
will
on the
say
sort
that that's evolving, Neil, in a wonderful way. Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to build on Neil's point about sorting the data out. More is not necessarily more, right? It's the minimum data that you need to affect a positive atomic impact on all the participants. And you really have to interrogate the answer to that question very carefully. Right. And I think because more is not more, right? And I think understanding that will help anyone get off the block when they realize that you're not talking about putting a person's life story in a data ecosystem. That's not what's needed potentially for vertical X in healthcare versus vertical Y in computer science. And they're just different needs.
So I just I want to respect the time of our panelists as well as our audience. And I also want to do a bit of a shout out. One of our audience members talked a little bit about the European wide framework, the work with the EduWallet, the EduID. There's stuff going on with Erasmus and so on. And the European Commission is funding a lot of work. So thank you for that contribution. I did make sure that it went out to the audience through the Q&A, and I wanted to make sure it was verbally acknowledged. I have to say thank you so much for a very rich discussion. Some of the threads of the things you need if you're imagining creating this kind of change. I will say it's not easy to do this. We started our work in my country back in 2014, finally launched in 2020. It takes a long time to bring people along, to get the data in order, to ask those tough questions about purpose and fit. What exactly are the use cases? What exactly are the data needed? Who are the people, who are the organizations that need to be part of your atomic network? And then don't stop there. Think about how you're linking at the front end. Think about how you will eventually link to other atomic networks, how you will continue to contribute to the trust brand. Thank you, my friends. I want to end by reminding everybody we have other webinars coming up, including one tomorrow on the Mexican education system. I have some Mexican leaders coming in telling us, helping us educate us and learn about that particular digital and credentialing ecosystem, which is new for many of us. At Oslo, we have tremendous sessions. I encourage you to check it out. Amalia has been putting some of the URLs in the chat. It's October the 29th to the 31st at the Grand Hotel on our website. Love to have you join us. We'll have people from all over the world, including some of our colleagues in our various webinars, including the one today, who will be coming together, putting their batons at the door and having good conversation about how to solve these problems together and continue to build out the ecosystem in a way that works for our citizens and learners. Everyone, thank you. Have an absolutely wonderful day. You'll see the video on our website for this series on the GDN network. Take care. Bye-bye.